views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. We decided to do a program about housing because the need for affordable housing in the Bronx is immense. Barely a day goes by that I, and I assume you too, don't have a friend, relative, work colleague, or acquaintance who doesn't say, I gotta find a new place to live. And truthfully, for the most part, in plain language, pickings are slim. And certainly finding something you can afford is increasingly difficult. As I went through the list of possible discussion subjects, it was long. Rent stabilization, public housing, predatory landlords, maintenance of existing housing stock, and on and on. Also, tonight's guests have taken legal action against Kushner Companies, that is Kushner Companies, headed by the president's son-in-law until recently, claiming that they have falsified building permits in more than 30 buildings. So housing is what we're working on tonight as we welcome back to BronxTalk, the founder of the Housing Rights Initiative. It is Aaron Carr. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And he's brought with him HRI's Director of Tenant Outreach. It is Kim Powell. Nice to have you with us, Ms. Powell.
Nice to be here.
Mr. Carr, let's just get a vision. How is the city doing? There's been so much talk about affordable housing. The mayor has a plan to construct thousands of new units. Has any of that had effect? Are we doing better, status quo, or are you concerned that we've actually regressed over, let's say, the past 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think we're doing slightly better, but not as good as we should be doing. And the reason why is because New York City has a broken housing enforcement system. So Housing Rights Initiative, we're a nonprofit organization. We investigate real estate fraud and we orchestrate class action lawsuits against predatory landlords. Our broken campaign finance system, our broken ethics system, and our broken enforcement system has created a system full of fraud. And we have seen this, Kim and I, when we investigate buildings that are rent stabilized, buildings where the landlord is only allowed to increase the rent incrementally each year. They are abusing the fact that our enforcement agencies are not looking. They are not looking at the data. They are not looking what landlords are registering with the government. And the result of that is fraudulent practices throughout the city.
Those agencies, DHCR for the state and HPD for the city, is that where your finger is going?
Absolutely. And other agencies. Essentially, so real estate comprises of over 10% of all political contributions at a state level. So what they have effectively done is they have turned our enforcement system into a real estate protection system. And that's why our housing woes are not just housing woes, they are campaign finance and democratic woes. So it's not a matter of them lacking resources, it's a matter of them lacking a political will to do something about this widespread problem.
I have had numerous conversations with real estate agents, real estate associations, and people who, at least in my judgment, because they're frankly regular people, business people in the Bronx, in many cases trying to do the right thing, and they are very frustrated because they say, you know, tenants are a problem in some cases because they do destroy property. They don't pay their rent on time if they don't either have the funds or they complain about something. And we are somewhat behind the 8 ball. How widespread is this? And can we at least tip our hat to some buildings and some people who are property managers who are trying to do the right thing?
Totally. Housing Rights Initiative is not anti-landlord. We are anti-stealing. And it just so happens because there is very little enforcement.
I love how he put that, by the way. That's great.
Very little enforcement. We have a number of legislative problems that we have to deal with. So the result of that is a lot of landlords are defrauding tenants in rent. there was a study conducted by the New York State government that found that over 40% of landlords were illegally overcharging tenants in rent-stabilized buildings. And one way that landlords can raise the rent in rent-stabilized buildings is by doing apartment improvements. And it allows them to take 2% approximately of the cost of those improvements and add it to the rent. But guess what? Landlords don't have to submit receipts to the government to prove that they actually did those improvements. The entire system is based on an honor system. The largest affordable housing program in New York City is based on an honor system. So it's created a situation where it would be nearly malpractice for landlords not to defraud tenants in rent because the system was created this way.
So let's just say, okay, we're going to fix the plumbing in a building or in a series of apartments, and they submit that they have done that. They don't really do the work, and then they get compensated or they can raise the rents because ostensibly they claim they did it.
So if they perform,
that is incredibly fraudulent.
If they perform apartment improvements, okay, they don't have to show the government that they actually did them. They are allowed to raise the rent based on this honor system.
Self-certifying.
It's self-certifying.
Right.
And
so the burden is on the tenant to make the challenge.
Well, you know, which brings in you into the conversation, Ms. Powell, and let's talk about tenants. So what is the play out and how serious is the situation? And I guess, does this contribute to the problem that I mentioned in the beginning, that somebody says, you know what, my building is falling apart, my kids are not happy, they have asthma, I got to get out of here. And then they look for another apartment, but it's too expensive. Is it because of the fraud in many cases?
Absolutely. I think part of the
Wow.
problem is the
That's a
rent
heck of an
overcharges. I
allegation.
think to somehow suggest that because tenants don't pay their rent is the reason why portfolios, buildings are failing in maintenance. I think quite the contrary. There are tenants that are paying their rent. What is happening, again, as Aaron pointed out, is there's cosmetic work being done in apartments. So you have the same systemic practice in place where a judge has ordered a tenant to perform repairs in a given apartment or within a building. And again, as Aaron pointed out, there's no oversight. And no court is going to engage a landlord in how to conduct himself or herself in ensuring that that condition is addressed in a manner that doesn't allow it to continue to manifest. That's a major problem with the whole issue of maintenance in buildings.
You know, New York City is the oldest city in the nation. Many of our buildings and many of the buildings in the Bronx, like you just drive down the Grand Concourse, you can see exactly what I'm referring to. They're old buildings. If there is a plumbing problem, and somebody calls, they could come in and maybe fix it in an apartment, put some new faucets or something like that.
correct.
But that never gets to the root of the problem.
That is
maybe
correct.
so here's the next question. If you own that building or if you manage that building, how can you get that fixed without a significant amount of funding to do that? Because either you got to take the building down, and then you really have no apartments, or you've got to do, you know, thousands of dollars.
And I
of
agree.
maintenance.
No one is saying that maintaining a building isn't expensive, isn't costly. My concern is when the problem presents itself and in the immediacy, there's a need to react. Not wait 10 or 15 years later for the problem to build. Case in point, where you have roofs collapsing and there's the call that thing needs to be addressed, landlords wait, so to speak, not all, some, to some period of time where they're constantly treating it cosmetically, that it gets out of hand and it becomes costly.
So then they'll go and they'll plaster the ceiling, but never deal with the leak in the apartment above, or
correct.
the leak on the roof, or then
That is
replace the whole roof. But again, I'm just going to be somewhat sympathetic to say somebody's got to pay for that. Is there funding? Are there ways for a landlord who says, you know what, I don't want to abuse my tenants. I'd like to have a good property.
Yeah.
Can they figure out a way to do that without it costing them more money than they can afford?
Yeah, so if landlords are struggling financially, especially landlords that have rent-stabilized buildings, they can actually, there's programs for them that they can apply to at a state level that would allow them to, I think, increase the rent. There are some years where 0 landlords have applied to that program. Very few landlords. There are landlords.
Sounds like the state DHCR needs to do a little promotional campaign.
Well, I think the landlords, they have one of the strongest lobbying groups, right, in the entire
of
city.
course,
So
sure.
I'm sure they are aware that, you know, there are programs out there, but I don't think a lot of landlords, for the most part, are struggling. But if a landlord is struggling, I absolutely am sympathetic to them, especially if they want to do the right thing.
Could they call you for housing rights and say, hey, I really want to do the right thing. I don't want to get sued. I don't want to get caught. I got some problems. And
Absolutely.
You could, at some point, Helen will put up the numbers and the contacts. So everybody, tenants and otherwise, who are interested in housing can contact you.
And let me say it, don't be misled. There's something called major capital improvements, that cost is borne over to the tenant. So when you have a situation where there are conditions within the common areas of building, the roof, the elevator, that cost shifts to the tenant. So it's not a question.
And legally it can be done as long as they actually do the work.
That is correct.
Established.
And just one side point here. If a tenant came to me and said, Aaron, I'm struggling, can I steal from my landlord? I would say absolutely not. That is illegal. That is fraud.
You put your rent in escrow just like the law requires.
Right. I don't want to live in a society where everyone's defrauding each other.
I want to move on to something else, but I want to just conclude with this. Maybe about 15 years ago, we had significant maintenance issues in the Bronx, and I remember doing a series of shows about buildings that have hundreds of violations, and they still exist. Maybe my read is less so. What I learned at that time was that the city only had like 4 building inspectors for the entire city, which is, of course, beyond ludicrous. Does the city have enough inspectors, or are they just not applying it? I mean, where is the shortfall in the city's oversight of this problem? And I don't know if Ms. Powell is better qualified. Which one?
Either one. It's multifaceted. Yes, the city agencies, they need more money and they need more resources, but there are 2 problems here. One, there's a political will issue, right? And that's what I always talk about. The New York City real estate sector is extraordinarily powerful. It has removed a lot of the political will from our city to actually do something or to handle these problems systematically. Then the second problem is there is a lack of deterrent. There's very little deterrent effect essentially happening here because the Department of Finance has failed to collect over $1 billion in fines that have been levied against landlords. So even when a landlord gets hit with a fine, most of the time they don't actually pay that fine because the Department of Finance is failing to collect it. So this is not just undermining affordable housing, it is undermining the rule of law.
Fascinating. I saw a press release from a Bronx assemblyman decrying the fact that there was an increase for by the Rent Guidelines Board of, I think it was 1.5 and 2.5%. Seems like a small amount. As I mentioned earlier, many people in the real estate business are saying, look, water taxes are going up, everything's going up. We need a little bit. Was that a fair increase, or should there have been no increase? Maybe we'll start with you, Ms. Powell.
When I weigh the inequities associated with investors, and I don't call them landlords, charging people amounts that are in excess of the legal amount, when I weigh that burden against tenants in relation to the cost of doing business, I say, who's zooming who here? At the end of the day, landlords are capturing their profits. There's no oversight when you talk about rent overcharges. So to suggest that somehow the 1.5% isn't enough to maintain the building, I think is a misnomer. It doesn't answer the question of the malfeasance associated with doing business with the whole concept of rent regulation, and that the rent overcharges are there, the profits to be made. So the question in my mind is, why is that money being put back into operating the business? That's not happening. What is happening is they're going out and purchasing other buildings. To the extent that I sued a landlord who owned 421 buildings, was he able to maintain 421 buildings with the income?
Is that rhetorical, or are you asking that question? Was he able to do that?
And that's my question. And I would assume that he would. If he had 421 buildings and I multiply that by the number of 60,000 tenants, it would seem somewhere in New York City he could get some oil for each and every one of those buildings. But you had people reaching out and complaining that they weren't being serviced. So it kind of begs the question, where's the inequity in those statements?
If you examine, and I look through some of the portfolio of lawsuits and other things that you folks have done, a lot of it was a case where landlords or property managers were staying in the rent stabilization system, but they were raising rents anyway. This is your experience?
That is correct.
This is
That
correct?
is absolutely correct.
And this is where we turn to you and talk about the Jared Kushner Companies situation, right? Isn't that in essence what you're alleging that they have done?
Oh yeah, so we have 2 class actions against Kushner Companies for illegally overcharging tenants in rent-stabilized buildings. And we also had another investigation recently that uncovered that they falsified not 1, not 2, not 3 building permit applications, but 80 building permit applications, stating that over 35 of their buildings had no rent-stabilized tenants in them. And they essentially were able to avert accountability and push out a lot of these tenants and flip these units into market rate units. And this is the outcome of having a broken enforcement system. New York City has given rise to the Kushners and the Trumps of the world. And this is why, at the end of the day, this is not a housing issue, this is a democratic issue, and we need to reform our governmental system to reduce the amount of fraud that has been hurting tens of thousands of tenants across the city.
So the lawsuit was filed while Eric Schneiderman was the Attorney General. He's no longer the Attorney General. Does that changeover, or has that changeover impacted any of the activity? Does it make it more difficult for you to get this supported and represented by the state of New York? Like, in other words, in essence, has there been a delay as a result of the changeover?
No, I know that the Attorney General's office was looking into this matter. From my understanding, they still have the same team. They're incredibly capable and proactive office. So I don't think that changeover will have any impact on the work we are doing.
Where is this action at? And now, Jared Kushner himself no longer involved, or these things happened while he was involved? Since we threw his name out, let's be clear about what his potential culpability would be.
Well, we're just focused on Kushner Companies, but in 2016, I believe, he was making, I think, about $1.5 million from the Kushner Companies. When Kushner Companies bought the 2 buildings in which we have class actions in, he still was the head of the company at that time. But our main focus is on Kushner Companies itself and reforming our governmental system.
What would be a settlement or a result of this that you would find to be acceptable? And of course, the courts move incredibly slowly. Realistically, where is it at? Is it just chatter at this point, or is there something actually moving forward?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's currently in litigation, but a positive outcome would be all of the units that Kushner Companies illegally deregulated are placed back onto the rent stabilization rolls, and the tenants are refunded the amount that they were overcharges, and they have their rents lowered to the correct amounts.
Is that a realistic result of this?
Absolutely. It's the only result we expect to happen.
It's a tremendous allegation, and I guess you'll be in touch with us as it moves forward. Ms. Powell, I want to talk to you about something you're quite familiar with, and again, I know the history of it, having sat in this seat for all these years, is Bronx Housing Court. And we used to be in the basement of the courthouse building on 161st Street, and we built a new housing court over the last, I guess, decade or so, maybe a little longer, I forget exactly when. Improved conditions, improved situations, or is it much like what Mr. Carr was saying, that structures and systems are broken, so it doesn't matter where you put them?
Absolutely.
What's your perspective?
Absolutely. While there's talk of town where legislation was implemented that properly spoke to harassment, and harassment being in the form of a landlord's failure to maintain repairs, and on the other hand, a landlord bringing a frivolous claim against a tenant for non-payment. So go back to your point on the issue of where the court system is. In my own personal experiences, whether it's because of the anomaly associated with the new piece of legislation that it gives tenants a window of opportunity to go in and defend on the issue of a non-payment, defend on the issue of constant repetitive practices of the landlord failing to maintain services, essential services within their units, I think that's still broken. And I think it's still broken because there are limitations associated with the housing court. While the housing court is a forum, an opportunity to engage the landlord on the issue of non-payment. There's also a piece to it that talks about a tenant potentially withholding rent because services aren't being provided to that tenant. What happens generally in those kinds of situations, either the tenant, the case in that instance, the tenant being the person in need of the service is parlayed off to the Supreme Court, or they're giving something that says, give the landlord access, and if things don't work out for you, come back in 30 days.
And then of course it means taking off from work and all the other.
Absolutely. So to me, it's sort of a very recidivist approach to handling what is a real problem. Often at times,
What would be a better approach?
well, here's what my recommendation is: the idea that somehow we continue to look at the system as a whole and not look at it in its respective parts. When you talk about repairs, people don't withhold rent because they've lived in the apartment 40, 50 years, like myself. They withhold rents because they have a genuine cause of action that says, I need my apartment fixed. So my solution to that is there needs to be a reform, restructuring of how we deal with the landlord-tenant relations in housing court, if housing court is the answer.
One of the discrepancies that has been around for generations is the idea of delay. Okay, I now understand what you're saying, Your Honor. Let me go find out and come back, and then you have to go drag everybody back into court, and then they come back and they didn't have it properly, and that still goes on. Presumably.
That still goes on,
and it's a heck of a difficulty for a tenant because they're taken off work, they may have kids that need care. On, and plus it's not always so fast when you get to housing court. So it's a lost day almost every time.
Sure, and let me add a thorn in the side. The other thorn in the side is, again, putting tenants at odds with what is a housing code maintenance enforcement component that fails to recognize the obvious. The obvious being that some of these conditions last over a period of time. Unfortunately, we can't tell the landlord how to fix that wall over there or the drop ceiling. In a situation where there's a ceiling that's full, it's not a question of a ceiling falling its own. There evidently is a leak. And the unfortunate piece is there's nowhere in the process that allows room for DOB or all the other agencies to step in and say, stop this practice.
Well, this is what we
fix
talked
the
about
thing.
before. So
Sure.
they'll go and they'll plaster the ceiling, but in 2 weeks later, there's a leak or some other issue
Absolutely.
that creates.
And it frustrates the tenant.
Mr. Carr, you've been involved in this idea of the tax benefits from the J51 abatement program. Talk to me about the discrepancies involved and why this is part of this whole issue that affects the number of affordable apartments we have.
Totally. So when a landlord receives a J51 tax benefit, they have to rehabilitate the apartment building. And as a condition of the tax benefit, 100% of the units have to be rent stabilized. So taxpayers are paying tens of millions of dollars for this program in return for repairing buildings and providing affordable housing. However, over 50,000 units were illegally deregulated while receiving this tax benefit.
So they were receiving the benefits, and yet the buildings did not have rent-stabilized apartments.
That's right. And we have orchestrated over 40 class action lawsuits against those types of landlords. And what makes this so reprehensible is that the city and the state know where these landlords are. They know how, because on their property tax statements, landlords have to disclose whether or not they're receiving a J51 tax benefit and the total number of rent-stabilized units. Anything under 100% rent-stabilized is unequivocally and factually illegal. This is not just an affront to tenants, it is an affront to taxpayers.
So just looking at the 40 class action suits, have any of them gone through? Is this just a massive way of cluttering up the courts? What's the status of those? I mean, 40 is a heck of a lot.
Yeah, they're all in litigation.
All are in litigation.
We've already have had a number of achievements. There are some landlords that restabilized all of the units' buildings.
As a result?
As a result, they've given back some money, tens of thousands of dollars, probably closer to $100,000 in one building, but not the correct amount. They're just trying to show the judge, I think, that we're now doing things in good faith, but we're not looking to get back some of the money that was stolen from tenants.
You're just
We're looking
gonna
to
keep going.
get all of the money that was stolen from tenants.
We're almost out of time, but Ms. Powell, I want to talk to you about public housing a little bit. To go through the ills and to go through the issues, I mean, we've dealt with it on the program, whether it be, lead paint, whether it be heat, those were the big things. But of course, there's leaks and there's elevators broken and there's security and there's sanitation, there's all these issues. Do you have the sense that with what has been done and with the amount of attention that has been given to all of these, with forcing the head of the public housing agency to resign, that there is forward motion, that there is some relief on the way, or are you concerned that it's all just keeps going around and around?
Respectfully, I think it's smoke and mirrors.
Really?
Until we
I'm really sorry to hear you say that. I was really hoping for a different answer.
Until we put something in place that talks about accountability, it's never going to cure itself. Until we hold people accountable, where billions of dollars are being poured in to fix the thing, and all that's being done at the doorstep is something that looks like a can of paint, we're going to continue to have those problems.
Does that have to be oversight, literally from the mayor's office, to insist that this comes down? Is that really
Absolutely.
who it is?
Well, here's what I think.
And then the next question, and again, boy, we could talk about this forever. We're almost out of time. Is what role should the federal government has? Is it simply to fund it, which now, of course, is another issue? How do you assess
here's
this?
the funding. There's the funding component, but there's also the oversight piece. You can easily hand somebody $5-10 million. The call to the question with NYCHA was who was watching the hen house. So while the funding was there, the thing was mismanaged, poorly mismanaged, and at the end of the day, we're right back where we started. And so I think a bigger piece in this nominally is the issue of oversight. Create some independent body that does the oversight.
We'll let Mr. Carr have a final word on that.
I just want to say the fact, there's no way to mince words here. The fact that the Trump administration had to compel the most progressive mayor in New York City in a $2 billion settlement to take better care of the poor will go down as one of the biggest embarrassments and the saddest moments in our city's history. It is unconscionable what happened. Things are going to have to change.
Housing Rights Initiative, how do people get to you?
They could reach out to us by email at info@housingrightsny.org. That's info@housingrightsny.org. If they have any tenant-related or housing-related issues, we'd be happy to deal with them or refer them to legal
Go to the
support.
website also, Housing
right.
Rights Initiative. You can just find it out. Kim Powell, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron Carr, thank you so much. We hope and expect we will have you back at some future date
Love
with
to.
better news.
Better
That's
news.
what we want.
Happier days.
Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on the show tonight or anything going on in the Bronx, and email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You can tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. If you would like to reach out to these folks and you want to go through us, we will make sure to get them the information, and we will insist that they get back to you. So please, with housing questions, if you're on the other side and you're a property manager and you heard this dialogue, get to us. That's what we're here for. You can check out our archives. You can see the last time Aaron Carr was on, which was a couple of years ago, at BronxNet.org. Find Bronx Talk by following the watch menu on the new BronxNet website. We thank our producer, Helen. Our director is William, the cast of thousands who are around us here in the studio, and we will see you next week. Good night.